Hi there, my name is Richard, and I'm here to talk about Job, the book of Job today, which is a very interesting thing. We do Bible studies here at our place on a Thursday night, and we've just started the book of Job, and I thought, hey, why don't we put some of this online? Hopefully, it might be helpful. So, the book of Job is one that everybody dreads to talk about or to hear about. And why is that? Why is Book of Job so difficult? I think it's for a number of reasons. The first is, let's face it, it's a lot of poetry. It's a lot of flowing words. It's a lot of what on earth are they talking about stuff. It's beautiful. I think it's beautiful. Also, the other thing about it is whenever you read Job's friends and what they're saying, frankly, it doesn't sound that bad. They don't sound awful, shall we say. You'd think it would be a lot more black and white and a lot clearer, the difference between Job and what he's saying and also what his friends are saying. So you hear his friends, you kind of go, okay, guys, they have some good points. And then the third thing is, why does God allow suffering? That's the big one. That's the big one that Job's all about. And none of us really want to, myself included, of course, before I looked into it, none of us really want to think, is this going to happen to me at some stage? But I'm so glad that we decided to do an in-depth study on the book of Job. It's not a verse by verse like we normally do in our Bible studies. It's going to be more, how should we say, concentrated, yes. Because if we do verse by verse, you're going to die with boredom over the poetry, probably. So the fact that the book of Job does talk so much about suffering is very relevant. And one of the big reasons it's relevant is because for the Jews, the topic of suffering, which comes from sin, it's a big topic for them. And we see that even in the New Testament. Whenever the disciples came to Jesus and they were talking about the blind man who was born blind, they said, Lord, who sinned, him or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said, none of them. This is for the glory of God. So, there was still that feeling and that concept. And unfortunately, this comes from a works mentality. This comes from a works-based mentality. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot, nobody can earn God's grace. God's grace is freely given. And all we can do is just go, Lord, I thank you so much. We receive your grace. So you can't earn God's grace. You can't earn God's favor no matter what. Because you're never, ever going to be good enough. So, as we will see. So Job also at this stage, and also, of course, all of his friends, they all had a works-based mentality. And a works-based mentality, it has two basic precepts to it. Good people go to heaven, and bad people go to hell. That's, if you're good, if you live an upright life, if you're a good person, you treat people well, you look after the poor and the needy, and you give and you're generous and you're nice, then you're fine, right? You're going to heaven. Sorry, it does not work that way, as we will see. The other thing is, if you're living, and what's very apparent in Job, is if you're living the way you should, if you're living in a godly way and you're doing good things, then God will bless you and good things will happen to you. But if you're in secret sin, or if you're living the wrong way or in unrighteousness, then God's going to get you. He's going to punish you. And bad things will happen to you, and that will be obvious. And of course, that's the conundrum. That's the nutshell of what happens with Job. So the book of Job itself, as far as time's concerned, scholars generally say that they think it's just before Abraham. Yeah, just before Abraham, probably in time. Some say it's contemporary, but I wonder at that because Job gets called the most righteous or the most perfect or blameless person in the East. And Abraham was sort of living not too far away from him. So I don't think that would be the title for him if Abraham was around, though Abraham at the start of his journey was probably not the same Abraham, certainly, who finished the journey. But anyway, we think it's around just before Abraham's time. The author is not known either, though most rabbis tend to attribute it to Moses. So I don't think it really matters. So let's just read through it and then we'll go back through it again. And also hopefully you'll see it up on the screen. I use a New King James Version in most cases. Sometimes I change just to get a different wording or what's a more accurate translation. There was a man in the land of Uz. Now, by the way, Uz is in southeast of Canaan, the land of Canaan. So that's down to the southeast of Israel today. So it's probably Jordan, in Jordan somewhere, or Saudi Arabia somewhere. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and the man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. And his sons would go and feast in their house. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, who also came amongst them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" So Satan asked the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around about him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So we'll stop. What we're going to do is we're going to stop there for now, and then we'll complete the chapter later. But we'll go back and we'll discuss this first half. So as I've said, that the land of Uz is in the southeast of Canaan at that time. Now the word here that is used for blameless, it's not sinless. And this is really important and becomes very important later. It's blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. What this word blameless is Tawm, the Hebrew word Tawm, Tawm. It's a person who loves truth and endeavors to live a moral and godly life. So he feared God. He had reverence and awe for God. So the fact that this was true, and that later on God actually calls him this as well, is evidence to the Jews that his suffering was not a result of any sin that he had committed. It wasn't a result of God punishing the sin in his life. So he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. This is an obvious sign of God's blessing. Sons were a big deal in those days, and he's got 7 of them. So he's doing pretty well. And then, of course, it talks about all his possessions, all his camels and oxen and servants and everything else. And it sums it all up with, so that Job was the greatest of all the people in the East. That's saying something, because most civilization was in the East at this time. Because this might only be 5 generations or 6 generations after the flood itself. So there's not that many people on the world. So he's a big deal. He's the biggest in the East. The most blessed. We should say he's the most blessed at this time. Okay, so sons go off and feast and ask their relatives and their siblings to come along with them. Now, of course, we all know whenever you get together with family, you kind of let your hair down a little bit. You might say some things you wouldn't normally say. And they obviously have wine and drink, so it might even get a bit raucous at times. So Job, because he knows that this is the kind of environment that stuff might happen, Job's very careful. He's so careful. He makes sure that there's no blame on either him or his family. He wants to stay in right standing with God. This is the crucial point. Even when he's not aware of something going on. So every time they have one of these feasts, he thinks, maybe something's happened. So he makes sacrifices all the time to say, hey God, forgive us, sorry, this has happened. Now, what's also a good point to remember here is that it's very rare for a very wealthy person. Job was obviously the wealthiest person in the East at the time, so he was very wealthy. But it's rare for a wealthy person to be in right standing with God. Often they're caught up with their life and everything around them and enjoying their pleasures. As you remember in the New Testament, Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Of course, we don't forget that after that he said, for nothing is impossible with God. So it's definitely possible. And then we come to when Satan comes before God. Now, Satan is the word that's used here, which actually means the accuser. So he's coming up to accuse Job in front of God. And the Lord said to Satan, like he doesn't know, right? So where do you come from? And Satan says, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it. Interesting. It's not quite true. Of course, what a surprise. And he's saying it to God. So we know from the New Testament that Satan has come to kill, steal, and destroy. So therefore, he's not just walking about, oh, gee, what a beautiful sunset it is today in India. Or what a beautiful sunset, sunrise it is in New Zealand. No, he's not doing that. He's always seeking to kill, to steal, and destroy. So he's not just roaming casually around. And the other thing the reason really why God is asking this question is he knows Satan is obsessed with Job. He knows that he's doing that. So he's saying, hey, why have you come? And then, and Satan hasn't said anything about that either, of course. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth? Now, a better translation for this, actually, in the Hebrew is, you've noticed my servant Job, haven't you? And I'll show you in a minute why we can say that. But that is just a better translation of the Hebrew there. You've noticed my servant Job, haven't you? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. So that's pretty amazing. Job's getting called blameless and upright by God. Props. But it doesn't mean sinless. We'll come to that. So Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around about him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Why does Satan say this? Satan says this because he's already tried to attack him. He's already had a go at Job himself. He's had a go at his household. He's had a go on every side. He's tried to find an angle to get at Job because he hates him. But now Satan's saying to God, now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. You got to give it to Satan. He actually knows human nature. He knows it really, really well. Most people, if some really bad, unexplainable stuff happens to them, there comes a point or there comes a limit where they're going to say, I give up. God, why are you doing this to me? I'm really angry. I'm really ticked off with you. I'm out of here. It's enough. And they would curse God. But, yeah, so this is the challenge. And the interesting thing here is, because he is blameless and upright, the most blameless and upright at this time, Satan says, right, I'm going to get him. And if I can get him, anybody on the earth will curse God. And so he's out to prove a point. Because Satan also knows human nature. And generally speaking, some people's point is much, much lower than other people's, particularly Job's. He's been amazing. Okay, and the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. If we read this in a New Living Translation, it's slightly better. It lets us see something. All right, you may test him, said the Lord to Satan. Remember, Satan asked God to do it, but God's going, nope. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. You see, Satan needed God's permission. So he needed God to withdraw his hedge of protection, because he had. So Satan needs God's permission. If we remember, and this is also true, Satan still needs God's permission. Remember, Jesus said to Peter, just before the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. I have prayed for you. So that's interesting. And also, if we look at 1 John 5:18, it says, we know that everyone who has been born of God does not keep on sinning. But he was born of God, that's Jesus, protects him. And the evil one does not touch him. Yippee! There we go. The evil one does not touch him. Okay. Let's move on now to the second part of the chapter. Not so good for Job. Okay, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their older brother's house. And a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were ploughing and the donkeys leading beside them, when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took them away, yes, and killed all the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their older brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. And that's the end of chapter 1. So let's go back and discuss the second half of the chapter. So Job loses all his property. All these messengers must have arrived pretty much simultaneously at the same sort of time. They were all, basically he loses everything. Donkeys, oxen, and then it's interesting, one of the messengers says the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants. But as we know, God wasn't doing anything. So it was the devil, it was Satan, who sent down fire, lightning, or whatever it was from heaven and burned them all up. So it's not the fire of God, it was the fire of Satan. And yes, unfortunately, he is able to do counterfeit miracles, and he is able to do some signs and wonders. Interesting that. Of course, not like God. Not even close. And certainly nothing creative. Everything's killed, everything's gone, and his sons and daughters feasting together, they're all dead. Then what's fascinating, I think, really, so he arises, he tears his robe in grief and distress, and he shaves his head, which was a sign of mourning, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. What? Worshipped? Job, what's the story? And what's very interesting here is, it shows you his heart, shows you his attitude. I think that's frankly amazing. He's just found out that he's lost everything, including all his kids and his family. And he falls to the ground and worships. Phenomenal. But I also want to point out the difference between praise and worship. God is always worthy of our worship, no matter what the circumstances are. It would have been a bit odd, I think, if Job had praised God for what had happened to him, because God actually hadn't done it. But he is always worthy of our worship. What Job was doing by that, he's declaring that God remains worthy of his worship, and he remains God in his life, even in the face of these horrible circumstances. So that was amazing. And then he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I want to return back to this saying. And it says, and this Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. Whenever Job says, the Lord gave, and the Lord taketh away, this is one of those sayings from the book of Job that often you hear it all the time. It's frequently quoted, particularly at funerals. I have a question for you. Is this a true statement? The Lord gave, and the Lord took away, or has taken away. No, it's not a true statement. It's based on the belief that God is the one who took away. And as we can clearly see in the earlier part of this chapter, it's Satan who comes to kill, to steal, and to destroy. God does not do any of those things. It's not in his character. He does not do that. So, it's not true that he thinks that God has, as Satan asked God to do it to Job. But God said, no, I'm not doing it, but I'm going to allow you to do it because it's what you do. So that's very interesting, I think. And it's, I think that little thing that little nuance, that little difference really affects our mind sometimes. Okay, so that's chapter 1. Thank you very much. Yes. Another point to note as we read through Job and as we talk about Job and also his friends and what they say. Oftentimes, and actually I've noticed this in the Psalms as well, we must not quote the sentiments, the emotions, the sentiments of Job and his friends, or frankly some of the Psalms, as if they are biblical truths, because they're not. So we mustn't use the sentiments of Job and his friends as if they're biblical truths, because in most cases, and we'll see that at the end of Job, they're not. They're based on a false assumption. They're based on a works-based mentality. But one thing we are going to see as we progress is we're going to see that Job's theology changes from a works-based theology towards a grace-based theology. He's going to change his perspective from a works-based theology to a grace-based theology. A theology that acknowledges three things. One, every single person, there's no one good, no, not one in the whole world. Everybody is a sinner in the eyes of God, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing anybody can do to be righteous in God's eyes. None. Nothing. Two, what that implies is we need a mediator. We need a mediator between us and God. And that mediator must be fully human and fully divine. Who does that sound like? And I'll show this, by the way, in Job as we go through. And number three is we need a redeemer. We must have a redeemer, somebody who is worthy enough, who is righteous enough to pay the price for us. So, of course, that's Jesus as well. But Job, fortunately, does come to this realization as he goes through this whole process. He does come to the realization, and he does change his theology to one that he recognizes that, number one, he's a sinner. In fact, he calls himself vile. He also understands that he needs a mediator between God and himself, which is Jesus. He also understands, he doesn't know it's going to be Jesus, of course, but he also understands that God is going to send a redeemer, and that he himself personally is going to see and know that redeemer. So that's all for chapter 1. We'll start in chapter 2 next week, hopefully. Thank you. Please feel free to leave any comments. And look, like with anything, I agree with Paul. Be a good Berean. Don't take my word for it. Go study it and look at yourself. I encourage you to read it. I bet you'll change your mind on Job, just like I did. Thanks very much for your time. Bye.